Hi, so in this video, I'm going to talk a bit about how to control the water part of watercolor and just a little bit how to think about that. I'm also going to go over just a few kind of techniques for how to get the paint on the paper. Seems simple, but it's not. And then a few techniques that you can use sort of in the later stages of the painting to give yourself more control. So before I talk about the techniques, I just want to talk generally about the water. So the water in watercolor, generally in the early stages of the painting, you're always building a painting from light to dark, and that goes hand in hand with wetter to drier, so that basically the early stages of a painting, you're wetting bigger amounts of the paper, and you're really just applying color in a very general way. You want it to almost mix and mingle to get just a beautiful kind of iridescent quality to your color. So to do that, the paper is very wet. So early stages of the painting are usually bigger areas, and they're done pretty wet, which gives you more time to get the paint on the paper and also more time to get expressive. One of the things that you might have noticed when you wet a piece of paper is as you're wetting it, it's beginning to dry. So everything is sequential in watercolor. You're working from lighter to darker and wetter to drier. So from the moment you wet the paper is starting to dry, and you have to really pay attention to not adding extra liquid. Once it begins the process of beginning to dry, you have to pay attention to how much liquid is on your brush. If the paper's beginning to dry and you add too much liquid, you get kind of what we call a bloom, which I'll probably show you in a minute. So one of the ways I use to control how much water is on my brush is I'm constantly going like this. So those two actions, that and also how to get enough water on the paper evenly, is another thing that's very important. So I'm just going to start with that. So I've got some water here, and this is what most people do. They take some water, and people for some reason are stingy with water. So you can see I've taken some water, and then what people do is they take that bit of water and they try to make it go as far as they can. And then they pick up more water, and what happens is this side of the paper becomes drier and this side is wetter, and so it's unevenly wet. So the proper way to wet a piece of paper is you want to do like scoopfuls of water, so maybe like about 1 inch or 2 square, depending on your brush. So each time I put a scoop of water on, I'm dipping back in. And you can always lift water off if you've got too much on here, but you really can't. You can always lift water off, but once you begin the process of painting on it, if you add too much water, then it messes it up. So I don't know if you can see this, a bead here. Hopefully you can see the bead. That's how you know you have enough water. You want to, in the beginning stages, you want to be able to move the water across the page. So you can hopefully see the bead there. So you don't want to ever drag the water. You basically scoop the water on, and this would be how you would start something that's wet on wet. And to keep the paper evenly wet, so now this is very wet. It's got a pretty generous bead. You can make it a little less wet if you want to by just literally dumping a little bit of the bead off. But there always needs to be enough water to be able to have a thin scrim of water moving across the surface. And even better, a little bit more. So I'm actually going to add back the water I just took off. So you can see I'm really paying attention to add an even amount of water. And then once you begin to put color on, Once you begin to put color on, you also, it's still very wet, so you can apply color very wet. You also don't want to do anything that will lift color off. So I usually don't apply color like this because that lifts the color. It causes it to be uneven. If I want to get some different colors on here, I use the brush kind of like an eyedropper. And this is just delivering the paint to the paper. Assuming you've wet a big part of the paper, like a sky area. Let's just say that's a sky area. So you can see I'm doing it almost the same as how I wetted. I'm using the brush like an eyedropper. This now kind of a huge puddle in the middle here. But I'm going to keep getting my first colors on. And once you're got this base of color on here, at this point you don't need all this water on here. So at this point I'm going to move this around and I'm just going to redeposit it on my palette. And then I have this beautiful, this is the perfect wetness to build color. I don't know if you can see that. I hope you can. So I have this really, really nice quality of color. And now the paper, it still kind of has a bead. That's kind of what you want to look for, is this ability for the paper to the paint to move on the page. And I hope you can see that bead. Without the bead, the bead is how you control the wetness in both wet on wet and wet on dry. If the paint can't move, then it becomes very static on the page. So at this point, you might notice this less of a bead because the water is evaporating off of the page. At this point, as long as it's still kind of evenly wet, at this point, I might want to build the color. Let's say I did this and I want it to dry to be this color. Watercolor dries 2 shades lighter, so it's actually gonna, it's gonna dry to be like that. So if that's not what I want, then if this is what I want, I have to actually add more pigment. So I'm bringing more paint in, continuing that process of eyedropper. You can also tell this way by just taking water towards paint, and this is going to dry to be that. And that's a really scary thing to get used to. It. This just looks so dark, but you'll be very surprised when it dries. So you can see I'm still using the brush like an eyedropper. And I would suggest that you do a practice piece as well. Now I'm drying the brush because I don't want this much liquid anymore. I want to just smooth this. And this is another technique, which is just using the point of the brush and very lightly pushing the paint around. You might notice I have a little bit of a big puddle in the middle. I'm just going to move that over to the edge. Okay, to keep it off the middle. And I still have that bead, which is nice. So basically, if you're happy with this, then you would just leave it alone. Generally, though, we get to a point, once some of the water is evaporated off, you're no longer as easily able to move the paint on the paper. This is when you can start to build strokes of color. You want to keep it wet, as we talked about, till you build just the general color you want. But let's say I wanted now to put like some nice juicy strokes of paint in. So I've dried my brush off, I'm pulling this on, and to make a stroke, there's 2 ways you can do it. One is a very light touch with the point of the brush and just go over it a few times and dry the brush. And then if you want to smooth it, you just keep going over it. So I'm using the point and then the heel to smooth it. If you want to make a stroke and you really want it to stick here, use the heel. You see that really presses this in. And it makes it a lot more definite. But once you get to this point, once you've gotten to this point, you really have to, there's not a lot more you can do at this point. I do have this kind of unpleasant puddle in the middle here. I don't know if you can see it. I'm going to wick it off with a paper towel. That's the best way to get off a big puddle because it won't leave any marks. And then if it does, you with the dry brush, blotting my brush so it's like a wrung out sponge, and using the point to just lightly smooth that in. And let's say these are feathering too much, just run your point along this and it will a couple of times. Another thing you can do, this is now what I would call shiny wet, where there's no extra water, there's no bead, but it's still wet enough to do some things. This is where it's very important to keep it to work from wetter to drier. I don't want to introduce any puddly paint at this point, only paint that is strong. So if I want to introduce some other paint, I can build these strokes a little bit. So now I have a purple on my brush you can see it's like that. And that's going to dry quite a bit lighter. But my brushes, I've got paint up to here on my brush. It's like a little bit like a fairly wrung out sponge. And now I can build into the middle of this stroke. And if I wanted to, and with the point of the brush, if I wanted to just make, add more to these strokes. And then using the point, very lightly smoothing it. And I do want to show you what would happen right now if you if you introduced anything wet right now. You can only introduce things that are fairly strong. You don't want to even go back to this soup right now because I don't know if you can see it, just that. Well, I'm going to talk for one more minute. So dry the brush, pull it up on the tip of the brush, and then I can just build this a little bit stronger or add more. With the point, I'm just very lightly touching it in. So this is now, again, I think I said shiny wet. So let me just show you what happens if you introduced, let's say you decided I don't want this here, I want it somewhere else, or I don't like this blue, let me try to fix it. Putting water on the page at this point, you can see what it does. And then you're stuck with these. They're very hard to get rid of. You sometimes can fiddle and get rid of it, but it's a big fiddle and it's usually going to change the quality. They're called blooms. And I don't know if you can see how icky now. That looks a lot not so nice. So you don't want to ever, this is what you want to avoid doing. That's uneven wetness. Okay, so that is, let's see. Okay, I can go for another few minutes. But that's just generally, that is just wetting the paper first with water. Another way to get paint on the paper that's kind of nice, this is a wet on dry technique, which means it's a misnomer because you're going to work wet, but you're putting very wet paint on dry paper. So to build color in this way, I talked about the bead before. The bead is very, very important. In this way, you're doing a similar thing, except you're not wetting the paper first. Sometimes Sargent would work this way, John Singer Sargent. He would basically just take some colors similar to how Impressionists worked and like just sort of, you really scoop this on. There has to be a bead. Hopefully you can see that there's a bead here. So, and then to add a new color, you join it at the bead. And this is kind of called mingling. As long as you put this on equally wet with a bead, you can just sort of mingle your colors. You can also mingle in plain water if you want one area to be lighter. You see, I just added some water. And this is a great way to begin a painting. If you had you were just wanting to get some tones on the paper. Oops. And you can see the mingling is really nice because the colors kind of mix to your eye they mix, your eye mixes in what the colors will be. So basically just keep joining chunks of color till you have what you want. You can also, so this is now at that wetness where if you want to add strokes of color, you can. I can add stuff to it. I can also, if I want to blend it more, just taking the brush, as long as it's still wet, I can just sort of do this. And that's just a gentle kind of a layer of color. That looks dark, but that is going to dry very light. But that's sort of that's mingling. So, great. I think I'm going to stop and we'll get to part 3 next. Part 2, I'm sorry.